Bart Erman, welcome back to Fresh Air. Explain the fundamental question that you're asking in your new book.
Well, the question is how it is that a Jewish preacher who was predicting the imminent end of the age as he knew it and ended up being crucified for his message, how is it that we went from a crucified peasant to the second member of the Trinity? Jesus eventually comes to be seen of as God, and the book is about how that happened. The earliest Christians thought that Jesus had been taken up into heaven and been made a divine being, and that he was coming back, and they thought it was going to happen very soon. So they had no idea that they were going to revolutionize Western civilization. They didn't think there was going to be a Western civilization. The end was going to come. During his lifetime, Jesus himself didn't call himself God and didn't consider himself God, and that none of his disciples had any inkling at all that he was God. The way it works is that you do find Jesus calling himself God in the Gospel of John, our last Gospel. Jesus says things like, before Abraham was, I am, and I and the Father are one, and if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are all statements that you find only in the Gospel of John. And that's striking because we have earlier Gospels and we have the writings of Paul, and in none of them is there any indication that Jesus said such things about him. I think it's completely implausible that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would not mention that Jesus called himself God if that's what he was declaring about himself. That would be a rather important point to make. So this is not an unusual view among scholars. It's simply the view that the Gospel of John is providing a theological understanding of Jesus that is not what was historically accurate. I was struck in doing my research by the fact that the New Testament never indicates that people came to believe in the resurrection because of the empty tomb. And this was a striking find because it's just commonly said that that's what led to the resurrection belief. But if you think about it for a second, it makes sense that the empty tomb wouldn't make anybody believe. If you put somebody in a tomb and 3 days later you go back and the body's not in the tomb, your first thought is not, oh, he's been exalted to heaven and made the Son of God. Your first thought is, somebody stole the body, or somebody moved the body, or hey, I'm at the wrong tomb. You don't think he's been exalted to heaven. And in the New Testament, it's striking that in the Gospels, the empty tomb leads to confusion, but it doesn't lead to belief. What leads to belief is that some of the followers of Jesus have visions of him afterwards.
You write that the first 20 years after the death of Jesus is particularly significant in perceiving Christ as God. What happens during those first 20 years after his death?
Those 20 years are really both really important and really mysterious because we don't have any Christian writings from the period. The earliest Christian author we have is the Apostle Paul, whose letters were written mainly in the 50s of the Common Era. So if Jesus died around the year 30 and Paul's first letter is around 50, and that's our earliest writing, that means that we have a 20-year gap where we have no writings at all by any Christian. And so it's a complicated period to study. What I argue in my book is that in the New Testament, including in the letters of Paul and in the book of Acts, for example, there are occasional passages that scholars have identified as what they call pre-literary traditions. What that means is that the authors are quoting materials that had been in circulation prior to the time of their writing, and so they're pre-literary in their traditions because they've been floating around for a while. What's interesting is when you isolate the pre-literary traditions in Paul, in the book of Acts, that refer to Jesus and his status as the Son of God, what these consistently point to is that Jesus became the Son of God when God raised him from the dead. That it was at the resurrection of Jesus that God made Jesus his Son. This is what I call an exaltation Christology. Christology simply means your view of Christ, and an exaltation Christology is one that says that Christ had been a human being and that God had exalted him to a position of divinity. The earliest Christians, during those first 20 years, the very earliest Christians appear to have thought that that's what happened. God raised Jesus from the dead and made him a divine being.
But there's another view of that, which is that, Jesus was always divine.
That's right. And what I try to show in the book is that that's a later view within Christian circles, that the initial view, based on these pre-literary traditions, is that Jesus is exalted to be divine, and that as Christians thought about it more and more, they try to put it all together. And so the first Christians, as soon as they believe in the resurrection, they think God has taken Jesus up into heaven, he's made a divine being. Then they thought, well, it wasn't just at his resurrection. He must have been the Son of God during his entire ministry. And so Christians then started saying he must have been made the Son of God at his baptism. That's a view that you appear to get in the Gospel of Mark, which begins with Jesus being baptized and God declaring him his Son at the baptism. As Christians thought about it more, they started thinking, well, he wasn't just the Son of God during his ministry. He must have been the Son of God during his entire life. And so they started telling stories about how Jesus was born the Son of God. And so they developed traditions about Jesus being born of a virgin. And so in our Gospels written after Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus' mother is a virgin so that he's the Son of God from his birth. As Christians thought about it more, they thought, well, he wasn't just the Son of God during his life. He must have always been the Son of God. And so then you get to our last gospel, the Gospel of John, where Jesus is a pre-existent divine being who becomes human. That point of view I call not an exaltation Christology, not going from a human to being made a divine being. I call it an incarnation Christology, where you start out as a divine being and then temporarily become human. And so these are the two fundamental kinds of Christology that you get in the earliest years, an exaltation and an incarnation Christology. This is something that is not widely known outside the realms of scholars. We today, many of us think of Jesus as the only miracle-working Son of God of the ancient world. As it turns out, he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of individuals in antiquity, in Greek, Roman, and Jewish circles, who were thought to be both human and divine. There were basically three ways that this could happen. You find this in Greek and Roman mythology, and you also actually find it in Jewish texts. Sometimes you have a human being who is a superior human being, either unbelievably powerful or beautiful or wise, and because of this person's superiority, a god or the gods or the God of Israel exalts the person to heaven and makes that person a divine being. So the person starts out as a human and becomes divine. That's one way that a human can be divine. A second way is that sometimes in legend and mythology, a divine being will have sex with a mortal, and the offspring will be a divine human. So that, for example, that's how Hercules is born. Hercules' mother is a mortal, but his father is Jupiter, the king of the gods. So that's a second way, someone born to the union of a divine being and a mortal being. The third way is that sometimes divine beings can take on human shape. And so when Jupiter comes down to get Hercules' mother pregnant, he comes down in the form of a human. And so gods can temporarily become human. Now, these ways of looking at it are found in Greek and Roman mythology, but they're also found in Jewish texts. The Christians took up all three ways and applied them to Jesus. The earliest Christians maintained that Jesus was a human being who was made God, a divine being. Later, they ended up saying that Jesus was born to the union of God and a mortal because the Holy Spirit came upon Mary, and that's how she conceived Jesus. So Jesus literally had God as his father. And then later Christians started to say that, in fact, Jesus was a divine being who temporarily became a human being. So these three ways of understanding divine humans in the ancient world are picked up by Christians who developed their Christologies accordingly. One of the things that struck me in writing this book is I came to realize with a clarity that I hadn't seen before that right at the same time that Christians were calling Jesus God is exactly when Romans started calling their emperors God. So these Christians were not doing this in a vacuum. They were actually doing it in a context. And I don't think that this could be an accident, that this is the point at which the emperors were being called God. And so by calling Jesus God, in fact, it was a competition between your God, the emperor, and our God, Jesus. When Constantine, the emperor, then converted to Christianity, it changed everything, because now, rather than the emperor being God, the emperor was the worshiper of the God Jesus. And that was quite a forceful change, and one could argue it changed the understanding of religion and politics for all time. Well, the conversion of Constantine is absolutely everything to the success of Christianity, but also to this developing idea of who Jesus was as a divine being. The problem was that Christianity itself was fragmented over this question of who Christ is. Is Christ a subordinate divine being who came into existence at some point in the remote past, or is Christ fully equal with God, and as one who's equal with God has always existed? So it may seem like a kind of a refined theological debate, but it was splitting the church. And Constantine wanted the church to be unified because he wanted the unity of the church to help him unify his empire.
So which side did Constantine come down on?
Constantine himself didn't really care. When he talks about it, he says he thinks it's a trivial theological matter and he doesn't really care, but he wants the Christians to work it out. He wants them to agree, whichever way they go. So he calls a council where bishops from around the world were called together to decide this issue, who was Christ. Everyone at the council agreed that Christ was God. The question was, in what sense is he God? They debated these issues, and eventually one side won out. The side that won out was the side that said Christ has always been God, and he's equal with God. He's not a subordinate divinity. He's not lesser than God the Father. He's actually equal with God the Father. And this became then the standard belief from the Council of Nicaea. Christians had a dilemma as soon as they declared that Christ was God. If Christ is God, and God the Father is God, doesn't that make two gods? And when you throw the Holy Spirit into the mix, doesn't that make three gods? So aren't Christians polytheists? Well, Christians wanted to insist, no, they're monotheists. Well, if they're monotheists, then how can all three be God? So there were various ways of trying to explain this, and one of the most popular ways that I talk about it in a chapter in my book was called modalism. It's called modalism because it insisted that God existed in three modes. Just as I myself at the same time am a son and a brother and a father, but there's only one of me, well, these theologians said that's what God is like. He's manifest in three persons, but there's only one of him. So he's at the same time, he's Father, Son, and Spirit. And so he's in three modes of existence. So there's only one of him. This view was very popular. It was held by some of the early bishops of Rome, in other words, some of the early popes, but it came to be declared a heresy because it didn't emphasize enough the distinctiveness of Father, Son, and Spirit. So, for example, when Jesus in the New Testament prays to God, he's obviously not talking to himself, and so there's someone else. And so God the Father has to be distinct from God the Son. And the church fathers who argue this have all sorts of clever ways of trying to demonstrate this, one of which is, if you've got a son, that means you're the father. But if you're the father, you can't be the son to yourself. You can't both be and have a son and be one person. So this was the controversy that led to the formation of the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity says that there are three distinct persons. They are distinct. They're not the same. They're all three different persons. They are all equally God, and yet there's only one God. Now, the best theologians have always classified that as a mystery, which means that you can't understand it with your rational mind. If you think you do understand it, then you misunderstand it. But you have the three persons, all of them equally God, yet there's only one God. Christian theologians wanted to insist that the Son could not be the Father, and the Spirit was not the Father or the Son. They're all different, and yet there's only one God. And so they ended up with a paradoxical affirmation that you have one God manifest in three persons. The three persons are distinct, but they're not different in degree, and they're not different in kind. They're all equally God, but there's only one God. And so this ends up then being a paradoxical affirmation.